gives me a great pleasure and tremendous honor to introduce Phil, Professor Philip Altbach, formally now. He's been with us for a couple of days and has been very productive since he left his spot. Phil is one of higher education's greatest, and I'll just leave it as that. I know I am under strict order to be short on his introduction, but I only accepted that under duress, so I would refuse that. On that, Phil happens to be my former advisor, mentor, continue to be my research partner, and now very good friend. I'm very happy to have him here. It took a long time to bring him here. It's nice that he's here now. Phil is the research professor and director of the Center for International Higher Education at the Lynch School of Education, where I was there for 10 years. He was still, well, until very recently, J. Donald Monon S.J. University professor, and he was a 2004-2006 Distinguished Scholar Leader for the New Century Scholars Initiative of the Fulbright Program. He has been a senior associate of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and served as the editor of 10 journals, including the Review of Higher Education, Comparative Education Review, and Educational Policy. Phil has published nearly 100 refereed journals, articles, authored or co-authored more than 15 books, over 60 edited and co-edited books, more than, how many book chapters, we don't even count that, and more than 10 special issues of journals on literally everything higher education. His most recent books include, with Jamil Salmi, The Road to Academic Excellence, The Making of World-Class Universities or Research Universities. I'm sure you remember Jamil Salmi spoke around those issues last year. Professor Philip Altbach held faculty positions at Harvard, Stanford, University of California, Berkeley, Wisconsin, Madison, State University of New York, some of the top universities in the US, and of course, in the world. Philip declared that he has retired some months back, but I don't see him do that, but continues to direct the center at Boston College. I'm very proud to be part of that center where I established the International Network for Higher Education in Africa, and now closely work with Phil in the process of moving that center to higher education training and development. Okay, I will conclude. I have a lot more to say, but for the sake of time, I will stop with very brief and short note. Phil has been a visiting professor at Stanford, as I said earlier, but he's also the chairperson of the International Advisory Council of the Graduate School of Education at the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. I'm sure you know that university and you know what they do. And a member of the International Advisory Committee of the High School of Economics in Moscow. So his expertise, consultancies, research interests cut across from China to India, from Taiwan to I don't know where. Welcome, Phil.
After that introduction, I think I should just sit down and be quiet. This morning, I have a daunting task, but a pleasant one. It's daunting because I want to provide you with a kind of a comprehensive background to the academic profession and its problems and challenges in a global context. You may yourself, as I proceed, translate in your own mind how what I'm saying relates to South Africa. But I'll give you first some bad news, and then for this country, based on my very brief observations, some good news. The bad news is the academic profession globally is in crisis. and I will spell that out quite clearly in my remarks this morning. The good news is, compared, and you may find this hard to believe, but it's true, compared to most places in the world, South African academics do quite well. And the terms and conditions of academic work in this country, including salaries, aren't so bad. In fact, they're among the better in the world. Compared to the African continent, South Africa is in a league by itself, and you all know that. So you have a kind of a special responsibility to Africa and a special responsibility, of course, to the country. Let me say just a few words of context, because the academic profession lives in a global academic context, and there is much going on in the world of higher education, which shapes our lives, our institutional lives, and personal lives also, in a very significant way. I'll just cover these comments very briefly through lack of time. Globally, the reality of the last half century or more is massification. And our DVC pointed out, and you all know it, that expansion is proceeding rapidly in this country and on the African continent. And I might point out that Africa is absolutely the last part of the world which is experiencing the phenomenon of massification. Access to higher education in Africa as a whole is well under 10%. Globally, it's in the 20%, and in the rich countries, it's in the 60s to 70%. I don't know the exact figure here, well above the African context. So massification is the dominant reality. At the same time, we have all become part of the global knowledge economy, and that moves us in the opposite direction of massification. It means that those of us in higher education, particularly in research universities like this institution, like a number of the better ones in South Africa, need to be deeply engaged globally, and I would say also a bit competing globally for the best minds to be involved in the knowledge network as it exists today. So on the one hand, you have massification at the bottom, and on the other hand, you have the emergence of research universities and the global knowledge economy at the top. And they are in conflict, absolutely, with each other, for money, for brains, etc. We have seen the tremendous emergence of the private higher education sector. I'll have a little bit more to comment about that later, because it affects the academic profession. In general, the emergence of the private sector has been at the bottom of the academic systems of most countries. It's been deeply problematical for the academic profession, and one needs to worry a lot about the quality, the orientation, and so on of the private university sector. But it's inevitable, because the state either does not want to spend the money or cannot spend the money to expand the public sector to meet the demands of massification. And by the way, massification is inevitable. No one can stop it, not even countries which are not democracies. The people demand it. The economy demands it. It will happen. Coping with it is, of course, the challenge. And one of the ways that countries have coped with it is exactly through the private sector. And we've seen, for example, in Latin America, which used to be for a century or more dominated by public universities, almost all Latin American countries, minus Cuba, have flipped to majority access in the private sector. And we can see this growing around the world. South Africa has not developed its private sector. In many ways, I think that's a very good thing from a policy point of view. to the extent that other countries have, although I was walking in the central business district here yesterday, and I counted about a half a dozen private post-secondary institutions on one street corner. Who goes there, how they're recognized, what they're offering, I hesitate to even imagine. So the privatization of the public sector is also part of global developments, where public institutions increasingly themselves become privatized, having to earn more of their money, having to be much more entrepreneurial. Not all a bad thing, but definitely affecting the academic profession. How we think, how we are compensated, how our job expectations, and so on. And that's a global reality. Just one small statistic. And this will surprise many of you, most of the great public research universities in the United States now receive under 15% of their annual operating budgets from public authority, from the states, which are their supervising arrangements. Okay, what has all this meant for the academic profession? And I'm going to talk now about some broad generalizations and some key factors, and leave you with that this morning. I want to leave some time for questions, answers, and discussion in this session. Overall, there has been a significant deterioration in the qualifications of those who are teaching in post-secondary institutions around the world. I don't know if that's the case in South Africa. It isn't much the case in North America and Europe, but it is the case globally. My estimate, based mainly on newspaper reports and other observations, is that the average person who is standing today before a class in a post-secondary institution has the qualification of a bachelor's degree. And that has changed over the years as a consequence of massification. The average qualifications of academics have overall gone down. There has been a deterioration in the working conditions for much of the academic profession. Higher teaching loads, lower on average compensation, we'll see a little bit of that in a little while, and other factors. And there is an increased number of part-time faculty. A smaller proportion of academics around the world are able to make a good, productive career with relative stability in their chosen profession. So the academe has become more stable and more part-time. Even in the United States, only half the new academic appointments in the last few years are on our traditional, what we call tenure track. That is, appointing people at the level of assistant professors and assuming with high productivity that they can go up through the system and get promoted and have a career in their institution, or maybe with a little bit of mobility among institutions. Only half are on that track. The other half, about equally divided, are part-timers, what we call, especially in California, freeway flyers. They go from one school to another, or what they call in Latin America, where about 85% of the academics are part-time. There they call them taxi cab professors, going from one institution to another. People who teach for very little compensation at a number of institutions, but have no permanent appointment. The other half of the American system are now full-time contract appointments, where people are not on the tenure stream, don't have a stable academic career, they have usually multi-year contracts, but they can be let go with changes in enrollment patterns, and so on. So overall, the terms and conditions of academic work have deteriorated to some extent. Let me say a few things about the culture of the academic profession. And really, I want to emphasize the cultures of the academic profession. The well-known American sociologist Burton Clark, about 30 years ago, coined the term, when analyzing academics, small worlds and different worlds. There is a common ethos, to some extent, among professors. We're all members of a glorious profession. Used to be glorious, anyway. But we're in very different cultures, institutional cultures, disciplinary cultures, and so on. And we all need, especially those of us who have administrative responsibilities, to think about that. Not only are academics divided by institutional type, research universities, teaching universities, community colleges, vocational institutions, and so on, but the mindset and orientation toward academe and toward scholarly work is much different for someone in the humanities than someone in the hard sciences. And often we forget about that. But understanding the culture is important from that point of view. A professor in a research university in the United States or many other parts of the world has a very different perspective on life, very different work responsibilities than even a professor in a research university in, for example, Nigeria. Their terms and conditions of work are different, their salary structures are different, and so on. So the cultures of a university are important, are complex, and are multifaceted, and we very often sort of forget about that, lumping all of us together. We're not at all the same. Let me say a few things about academic appointments and contracts, and then I'll show you some amusing statistics about salaries. The data for what I'm saying about appointments and contracts and salaries comes from a research project which I carried out with colleagues at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and with a group of research colleagues from 28 different countries looking at patterns of salaries and so on. So that's where this data is from. The book is called Paying the Professoriate. You'll see it at the end of these few slides. To have an effective academic profession, the terms and conditions of academic contracts must be both attractive and effective in ensuring accountability and productivity. It's not enough to simply appoint someone at the beginning of his or her career and give them a permanent job and hope that they work out. A few countries still do that. Many countries used to do that because academics were considered to be civil servants. This was the pattern in continental Europe and in some other parts of the world. And when you are appointed as a civil servant, the assumption is after a short probationary period, you'll have a permanent job and sort of float up the ranks with regular salary increases, not based on productivity, but based on longevity. That's changed in most parts of the world. Although in Saudi Arabia and small number of countries, that is still the case. When a Saudi is appointed to a full-time academic job, he mostly, well, actually not always he or she, because the women's universities in Saudi Arabia are quite numerous and an important part of the gender-differentiated system, he or she has a job for life. And I think that's affected the productivity of Saudi faculty. So competition is just as important as as a stability, but you have to have some stability as well. Stability and accountability, in my view, are the key words for shaping an academic career. Global patterns change a lot from place to place and time to time. I mentioned Saudi Arabia, easy to get in, difficult to get out, but not many incentives for hard work. Germany has an interesting system. Of course, the Germans invented the concept of the senior professor, and in some ways the academic profession, the modern academic profession itself, when they reformed their universities and the Humboldtian reforms at the University of Berlin in 1818. But the German universities have been transformed in a way that it's quite difficult for a young person who gets an initial academic appointment to rise up through the ranks. The assumption is that after a period of time, you will go to another university and get a promotion there. And maybe you'll come back to your original institution later. That has proved a very difficult situation for German academics and has been a significant deterrent to the best and the brightest going into the German universities. In fact, we have many top German scholars working in the United States, mainly because the terms of academic work and the career structure is much more favorable toward a normal development of an academic career in the context. It's just too difficult. The Germans understand that, have been trying to correct it, have made some reforms, in fact, in the last few years, some significant reforms, but it's still an issue. I mentioned these matters. The U.S. Traditional tenure system, which I think has operated exceedingly well over time. It provides very stiff accountability during the early stage of the academic career to get promoted and appointed to tenure after a maximum of 5 years as an assistant professor. In most U.S. universities, even those which are not heavily into research, means a very significant evaluation of your academic work by expert committees, by your colleagues, and so on, and then promotion. And many don't make it and have to leave the institution. You cannot stay as an assistant professor for more than that one term. Most make it through the system, even in the research universities, because we do a pretty good job of initial appointments and a reasonable job, much improvement needed, in most of the world. I do not know the situation in this country, but it's quite important, to provide mentorship, evaluation, messages, and guidance to the young faculty so that they can make it through the system. Very important. Universities mostly don't worry about the academics. We're part of the woodwork. We are the core of the institution on the one hand, but the institution takes us for granted on the other hand. It's true. And you cannot have a successful academic institution, be it a research university, be it a teaching-focused college, without a committed academic profession, no matter how much money you put into it. And I see this in my frequent visits to Saudi Arabia. They have no problem with money. Their problem is qualified staff and a regime that provides both encouragement and accountability. And that's central to building a successful university and, of course, a successful academic system as well. Contracts must have a clear career structure, like we have now only half the time in the United States. Our other 50% of new academics, they don't, and that's going to create a severe problem for the system going forward. And nobody understands that, or nobody cares about it, but it's very much part of the arrangement. So the key elements of the contract part are a career path that's based on accountability for academic performance, that promises promotion if you do good work, that's transparent, which we do have difficulties with in the US and other European countries. What's required to rise up in the system? You know, is there a list? How many journal articles? How many books? And so on. Nobody tells you. So you have to sort of figure it out for yourself. And of course, it will vary. And by the way, I think one of the rigidities and problems in this country, as I've been told, and in many others, and this is an artifact of the rankings, which I think we're too much obsessed about, is that we count journal articles, but for many fields and disciplines, in the humanities and even in many of the social sciences, books are very important as a part of academic productivity. And we don't count them enough. Why? I think mainly because the rankings and the easily available bibliometric tools, Social Science Citation Index and ISI and so on, count and measure journal articles, but not books. And you can do all kinds of manipulations, as I'm sure your administration and maybe some of you do for yourselves and for others, to see who's on top, who's productive, who's cited, and so on. That's all fine. These are pretty good measures, but they don't measure all of academic productivity. And this is a slight digression, but actually quite relevant to the theme of this conference, the rankings don't measure teaching. Why? Because they can't. Because we don't have any good measures for teaching anywhere. We're trying. Many academic systems and institutions increasingly are doing much more than giving student evaluations. They're doing peer evaluations in the classroom and a range of other things. But still, we do a very bad job. And cross-culturally, it's kind of impossible. Anyway, very difficult. And we're not even at the first steps of trying to evaluate teaching across countries and institutions. So that's an issue. And of course, the theme of this conference is teaching and learning. Maybe next year it should be learning and teaching, because that is a global trend. And in the US, increasingly scholars, administrators who are working on these issues are talking about learning and learning outcomes as just as important as teaching. It's not enough for us to stand up in front of the class, but you guys have to be, when you're looking at your computers or iPads, not playing video games, and paying attention and also interacting. So this is a whole new kind of area of concern and development, which doesn't fit at all into the rankings and is a significant challenge, especially for the research university sector, where our major goal is to make sure that we have appropriate research productivity. And we should, because in the context of a research university, research is king or queen. And that's the way it is, and it's probably the way I'm going to sound like a little conservative, probably the way it should be, because that's our mission. But we also teach, and we need to do the teaching, and we need to make sure the students are learning as well as producing the research. Let me, so to summarize the contract elements, we need to have a career path that's based on accountability, performance, and promise, and that makes it clear to young faculty, even old faculty, that they can make it in the system if they are productive and good colleagues. We need to have a contractual arrangement that provides stability, and we need to have clarity of appointments. That is, how do you get from one level to another? Whole issues of inbreeding of faculty, I believe a problem in this country, and my colleagues in Moscow and I are currently beginning a small research project exactly on inbreeding, because the Russians have that in spades. They have a very serious inbred faculty workforce. People who do their doctorates stay at the same university for their career, and there's very little mobility among the institutions. And they are worrying deeply about that problem. And it's a problem in many countries. And I would say detrimental to a very productive academic profession. Let me talk for a few minutes about what I'm sure you came here to listen to me about, and that's salaries. And how does South Africa stand in the salary race? And I have just a few, if I can work this thing, slides with regard to academic salaries. As I said at the outset, this data comes from our Paying the Professor project. We were able to compare salaries in these 28 countries with pretty good data. Problematic, I won't wash the dirty linen in public here, in a few countries. And we were able to compare the salaries according to purchasing power parity. So that means our Russian colleagues are economists, so they know what they're talking about. That means that we're comparing the salaries on a pretty level playing field. So you can actually get pretty decent comparisons here. We found, this will come as no surprise, that in no country at all, not even the US and Canada or Western European countries, where salaries are perfectly adequate, in no country at all do academic salaries compare equally or favorably to salaries of similar trained people on the outside. In other words, academic salaries are never competitive with the highly trained labor force. So we are all giving up, no matter how high our salary is on average in any country, by being in the university. Yet, some good news, there's another recent study of about 50 countries' academic, the attitudes of academics. It's called the Changing Academic Profession study. I think South Africa is one of the countries, in which, despite all the problems and woes which I have been discussing this morning, despite the salary problems, academics, by and large, are happy with their profession. They've entered the profession not to make a lot of money, but because they are committed to teaching and learning and the academic community, and they value academic freedom, independence, and so on. So those of us who have any responsibility for managing institutions, as well as those of us who are in the teaching area, we need to protect that, because that's aside from a decent salary, that's the core of why people go into the profession. And strangely enough, there are still young people, despite all the problems, who make a choice to do a PhD and to become academics. Even where the job market is not good, that's the case in the United States, it's not terrible, but it's not great, or salaries are very, very low, as we can see in a number of our countries here. So, as I said, no country offers academic salaries that are competitive with the broad economy. Of the countries in our study, the academic profession in most of those countries doesn't provide an average acceptable middle-class salary without people doing other work. In other words, moonlighting. And to us, that's the bottom line. You know, academics don't necessarily have to be rich, but academics do need to be able to live a decent life according to the middle class of their own country. They don't have to have the same salaries as top professors in the United States or in Canada or in Saudi Arabia, the three top countries in our study, basically. But they do have to have middle-class salaries. I think in South Africa, you do. So let's hope that remains. But in much of the world, they don't. These are average salaries for the whole academic profession. And you'll see, interestingly enough, that South Africa is, on average, does pretty well. Again, purchasing power parity. And you'll see that, surprisingly enough, the United States is less high in the list than one would think. That's because we have, and I think I have a slide on this, we have a rather unequal salary structure. The stars earn a lot, top in the world, but the average professor earns less. There's a bigger gap, as there is in our society generally, between the rich, the super rich academics, still underpaid by some standards, and the rest. The Canadians are number one because, like Canadian society generally, the academic system is more egalitarian. There's no star system. There's no way in Canada that a super productive academic is going to make a lot of money. And that's why many super productive Canadian academics are working in the United States. But lots of them stay at home. These are entry-level, average, and top. And again, you can see that the United States does better. The South African system is also not bad in this respect, and so on, and the other countries go along it. We were surprised, and our Russian colleagues were not surprised. I think that's one of the reasons they undertook the study. The Russians, on all salary measures we have, do horribly. They are not well paid. And you can see what's happened in the quality of the Russian academic system in the last 30 years since the fall of communism. Under communism, the professors were pretty well paid, and they got a lot of other perks. So they were not fat, but they were relatively happy. They didn't have freedom, but they had a stable career. After communism, things changed. They are now getting better. There's been big reforms in the Russian system. They are continuing those. They understand that they have a deep problem. But there are many. We were also somewhat surprised that the Chinese do so badly on salaries. Your average Chinese professor must do some moonlighting to make a stable career. These are ratios from the top to the bottom. The most unequal one in the world is China, where, again, stars do very well. The United States is actually less, on average, the ratio between top and bottom isn't so much, but there are stars at the top. And in general, the European countries are more kind of, are less unequal in terms of top to bottom academic salaries. The best and the worst paid, this is the most amusing one maybe, at the entry level, average and top, and again, South Africa does pretty well by these comparisons. The countries which are at the bottom need to worry a lot about their academic futures. This is where the data comes from. Let me say 2 minutes about academic freedom and then conclude. Academic freedom, of course, is the keystone of the academic enterprise. It's my impression, based on 2 days of, well, 4 or 5 days of expertise in South Africa. I've always had the view, if you are in a country for 2 or 3 days, you're an expert. If you're in a country for a week, you know nothing. So by the time I go home in a couple days, I'll know nothing, because I will have been here a week. But now I'm half an expert. My impression is that academic freedom here is in pretty good shape. It's useful, however, to look at academic freedom analytically. It's an original Western concept invented by von Humboldt in the 19th century in Berlin, in which he defined academic freedom as the freedom to teach in your classroom, the freedom to do research in your field, and the freedom to publish that research in your field. It didn't mean that academic freedom extended to the public sphere. The Americans in the 1920s, actually, expanded the concept of academic freedom to protect professors' speech and writing in everything, So the guarantee, usually recognized, not always, because we've had some problems and legal cases, the guarantee in the United States, and now in much of the world, or the assumption anyway, is that professors have academic freedom not only in their own area of expertise, but in the general public space, and that they cannot be fired or sanctioned for their expressions, writings, TV interviews, whatever it is, on any topic whatsoever. And the difference between professors and the rest of society, which also in much of the world has freedom of speech, is that we have a guarantee that our institutions won't get rid of us and won't make life difficult for us if we speak out. In the US and most countries, other employers can fire you in a minute if you do something they don't like. So one could have a long philosophical discussion as to what are the rights and also the responsibilities of academics, and what are appropriate limitations on academic freedom, because there are probably some, which is beyond the scope of this particular conversation. But it's worth thinking about. What does academic freedom mean? How should we exercise it? How is it used in a complex society? This society is a very complex society. What rights and what responsibilities do we all have? So let me summarize a little bit. Overall, the professoriate finds itself in generally poor and slightly deteriorating, in some countries significantly deteriorating conditions as the 21st century progresses with massification. We've seen a huge growth in the inequality within the profession with the rise of the research universities. Research university professors are a different breed, must be, in terms of qualifications and work, often salaries, and so on. versus the rest. And we're seeing as access expands, as the nature of academic institutions becomes more differentiated, naturally the academic profession is becoming more differentiated and less equal itself. All of those involved in the academic enterprise, governments, academic leaders, all of us who are part of the academic community as teachers and hopefully also as learners, need to make sure we understand this changing environment and the changing work situation that we face in that environment. And that's really my message. Life as an academic is more complicated. Life as an academic in South Africa, by global comparison, ain't so bad. Be happy a little bit. But we do face challenges, and we do really need to understand the context and reality of the system in which we do operate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, very much indeed. I do not even contemplate trying to summarize what Phil said. He said he gave us bad and good, and he ended it up with a good note. And if there are any South Africans who are whining, you have no space here. Okay, with that comment, I would open up the forum for questions. Depending on the traffic, I will probably ask everyone to be precise and concise in their articulation, and then we'll go from there. Now, now you can throw your questions, comments, observations. Let me start from Karen McGregor.
Luckily, I'm not an academic, so I'm in a profession which...
You just have to speak up on it.
I'm in a profession in which potentially at least I can make an above average salary. Regarding your research into global academic salaries, there isn't much research like that around, and I just have two questions. And the one is, where do you take your project from here? Is it going to be regular research into comparative academic salaries? But the question I'm really interested in is, what sort of impact does this information on salaries possibly have on global academic mobility? Are you noticing any sort of connection between academic salaries and where academics are going?
This is a snapshot, and we don't have any ability to really go forward and do it again. Hopefully somebody else might. However, two new studies have come from our group, mainly due to the initiative of the Higher School of Economics, related to this study. One is a research on the challenges to young academics. That is, what are the conditions and problems and challenges of people entering the profession? And again, this is a Russian problem, got them going, and we also believe it's important. So we're collaborating, and there are about 12 different countries that are involved in that. And the last one, which is just beginning with us, is a smaller study, again stimulated by Russian problems, of inbreeding, which I mentioned in my talk. So there are some ongoing things, but maybe unfortunately we have no way of redoing that study, which was a very significant challenge to get the data, to analyze it, and so on. Your other point, which is really quite interesting and important, and those people who are interested in global mobility should read our book, because they can tell very quickly where they should be applying for jobs. But it would have very significant impact on global mobility. And we can see this in the real world, looking at where academics go. Lots of academics from the continent, African continent, come here. Why? You can see it. Easy answer. Plus a whole range of other factors. You can also see that there is still a brain drain issue from Western Europe, and especially the former Soviet bloc, to North America, Canada, and the United States because of salaries. And we've seen, very interesting, I mentioned this in passing, significant brain drain from Germany to America, not so much because of the salaries. Our salaries are a bit, on average, higher than theirs, but that's not the broad issue. The broad issue is the career structure and the contracts. And the German government is deeply worried about this. In fact, I speak every year at a conference at MIT, which the German government, at great expense, sponsors. Why? To bring together Germans who are teaching and who are postdocs and doc students in the United States, trying to convince them to go home. So they bring them to Boston and give them a sales job. But it doesn't really work because they know, the Germans know what their home reality is. So yes, this study and other factors, which people just know, have a significant impact on global academic mobility, which is growing, which is largely a south to north phenomenon. We can consider South Africa as semi-north, although it's very south. And it's a very complicated issue. And of course, Europe and the United States are doing the best they can these days to steal the brains from the rest of the world. We are putting into place, despite 9/11 and other security issues, immigration regimes which encourage people to come from elsewhere to the U.S. Just finally, one very small statistic, we have very good U.S. data about what happens to PhD graduates who finish from overseas, other countries, who finish their work in the United States. From India and from China, over 20 years' time, 80% have not gone back. 80%. And these numbers are in the high hundreds of thousands. So India and China, thank you so much for benefiting the U.S. economy. And by the way, even with the rise of the BRICS, the data we have from the survey of earned doctorates, which is very good data in the U.S., is that the numbers who are choosing to go back from those countries, and a number of others, has increased, but not a lot. So too long an answer.
Just to recap what Phil said, America steals more than 500,000 every year, the smartest and the brightest around the world. So that keeps America going. Anyway.
There are a few other things, too.
Yes, a few other democracy and all that. Yes, please.
Please do give us your name and where you are. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Philip, for the presentation. My name is Nobuhle Hlongwa. I'm the College Dean of Teaching and Learning in Humanities. You raised an important issue of rankings and made it clear that it's disadvantaging humanities and social sciences, especially on issues of books. And I just wanted to know, because there has been wide arguments internationally and nationally on the role of humanities in knowledge production. And as humanities, it is felt that we're not doing our work. So what would you recommend as the way forward? Because, for example, our university has taken a keen interest on rankings. Thank you very much.
My biggest recommendation is take a slightly less keen interest on rankings and analyze them carefully. Rankings have a role. They are benchmarks in certain important areas. And as you know, I'll try to avoid a lecture on rankings, which you can invite me next year and I'll give you that because I've thought a lot about that issue. There are three global rankings: the Shanghai academic rankings of world universities, the THE, Times Higher Education, and the QS. I would pay not much attention to QS, despite the fact that a number of South African universities have done relatively well in the QS, because they rely a lot on reputation. The more you rely on reputation, the less reliable is the ranking. But overall, the rankings, as I mentioned briefly in my talk, emphasize research and particular kinds of research. They tremendously privilege the Americans, the Canadian, the large English-speaking northern, including Australia, academic systems. We're the ones who control the journals, have the editors, and so on. These are deeply problematical for countries which are not in that sphere. South Africa is sort of in the sphere. Although geographically separated, it's part of that culture through language, through overseas study, a whole range of things. So, but to cut the answer short, for the humanities and social sciences, as I mentioned, I would hope there would be a way for the universities in this country and other countries to include books, to include artistic achievements and so on that are obviously beyond the rankings, and to be more broad in the way that academic work is evaluated. Not easy, because it's so easy just to look at the bibliographic measures, but nonetheless, we deserve it.
Just what Phil said, this bibliographic rankings only consider 5% of the total articles or journals produced, and Africa is not in their heart. That's one comment I just want to make.
But another thing to worry about is there are now hundreds and thousands of fake journals, which is, as you have a national list here, I don't know exactly what's on that list, and I'm sure it's selected well, but one needs to be increasingly worried about that. And it's very easy for these fakers to fool us, even us.
Yeah, as long as you got a credit card, you're published. Chika, and then Michael. Oh, okay, you got a mic already. Okay,
I'm Betty Govenden. Yes. I'm part of the university life in this country for about 50 years. And in many ways, apartheid defined the agenda for the university. My concern now is how does deepening and developing a critical democracy define the agenda for the university. And so for me, that's my passion. And a lot of work is being done. I'm wondering how the university could be more seen in the public sphere. And the way in which, for example, traditionalization or re-traditionalization of society is taking place in the name of democracy, to quote one example, and all the other phobias that we're so aware of in the name of some democracies. How does the university speak fearlessly to this kind of creeping power? Because that's our tradition.
Hi, I'm Chika Sohola from the University of Pretoria. I just want to find out, Phil, your comment on the impact of non-recognition of books in the rankings. What's your view on that?
Thank you, Chika. Michael?
Thank you very much, Michael Samuel. I'm from the School of Education here at UKZN. I'd like to address the issue about the hiring patterns that you raised. Given in the South African concern with the high degree of inequity within the current system of racially skewed academia, what we have is an employment equity process of hiring individuals who will alter that particular rank distribution at the moment. What this means, maybe it's more a comment rather than a question. What this means is the agenda has to be constructed not only for academic access of students, but also academic access of staff. But the problem doesn't remain there. It's not just their access into becoming members of the academia, but also how we're paying attention to their success in the way in which their career trajectories, because invariably they remain stuck at the bottom of lower ranked portfolios and positions within the institution. And I think this creates a seduction that we're changing in terms of the meeting of equity profiles. So I'd like to hear your comments about how equity issues are addressed within this particular higher education terrain.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions before I give a chance for Phil to respond to. If not, yes, please. Your name and your institutional base.
Thank you. My name is Lungi Sosibo. I'm from CPUT. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to problematize your statistics. I've worked in different states in the United States, and I just have an issue because if you say the salaries in South Africa are higher than those in the United States, do your statistics, your United States statistics, take into account the different standards of living in different states? Like, for instance, if you work in, let's say, a small town like DeKalb in Illinois, compared to and having worked in Los Angeles in California, where the standard of living is very high. So basically, your salary, it doesn't, the standards of living are different, and so how basically how do your statistics take into account the living standards? Because a person in South Africa may be confused.
I got your question.
Oh, you got it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Albrecht. I think my question comes to issues around academic culture. With the growing materialism within higher education, how in your study these academic cultures with the usually egalitarian have been influenced in one way or another because of the hiring patterns and salaries?
Very good question. Then, Phil, I'll give you a chance.
Okay. A couple of these questions are unanswerable, especially in a short time. And I'll take them kind of as comments rather than questions. And very deep issues, which deserve a lot of thought, like yours. How does development in a critical democracy affect the university environment? And it certainly does. And I think that's for you guys to work out, not me. Similarly, affirmative action. That's, as we all know, a deeply divisive, complicated, politically loaded, culturally complex issue in all the countries where it exists. We've struggled with it in the US. I would say, here we're talking about the academic profession, not the broader society or, for that matter, student enrollment, where it's very important also. I would say that we see several contradictory trends in the American data over time. One is we have seen, no question, a tremendous broadening of the faculty base in terms of diverse cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, even social class backgrounds, over time. We have not seen a tremendous change in those factors in the research universities, which tend to be, big surprise, in our context, more white, more upper middle class, and so on. Although there has been fairly good progress there also. We do measure carefully the issues of race and ethnicity and so on. We don't have sort of forced, forced quotas for appointments. And I would also point out that mainly this is relevant for students, but also for academics, the U.S. Supreme Court, in its current conservative guise, has been notably unfriendly to affirmative action of all kinds. So there are now significant legal restrictions on the application of affirmative action. India has about the most dramatic affirmative action programs, they call it reservations, that I know of anywhere in the world, where they put aside certain percentages of appointments, both for faculty and for student admissions, for a whole long list of caste, racial, ethnic, et cetera, groups within, not racial, but within that society. And it's had some good impact, and from many commentators, some very bad impact on quality of higher education, particularly at their top institutions like the Indian Institutes of Technology. So it plays itself out in different ways in different countries. And my only comment, sort of broad global comment, is you can't take this important social goal that far in the research university context if you want to have world-class universities. Equality in terms of race and ethnicity will take a long time in those institutions, which in my view are very different kinds of institutions than the mass system, where I think there is more possibility. So you have to be, in my opinion, very sophisticated about how quotas or other guidelines are applied. That may be a slightly unpopular thing to say in this room. I don't know, but that's how I see it. Chika Sahuli's comment, and by the way, Chika is our South African researcher on the salary study, so if you don't agree with any of the data, talk to him. Throw tomatoes at him. There is no chance, unfortunately, of including book productivity in the global rankings, because the current bibliographic measures simply don't report them, and the rankers use those measures. Highly unfortunate. Now, it might be possible with sufficient kind of pressure on the rankings, maybe especially Times Higher Education, which is more amenable to thinking about these things, to get them to figure out how to collect data from books, but it's harder to evaluate in the usual bibliometric ways the impact of books, book chapters, book authors, citations in books, and so on. It's just more difficult. That's unfortunate for us, or for us who are in the humanities and social sciences. But that, I think, is the system. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Phil. I think for luck, I'm sure you would have time to talk to Phil. He would be around. And for the South African study, now that you know to whom to talk to, as long as you have tomatoes, just throw tomatoes at him if you don't agree. But just as a token of appreciation, this is for Phil. I hope you will have a space for you. And just to say thank you to him. Thank you very much.